So, having decided to have a cystectomy, your bladder removed, we then talk about reconstructive options. And the two key reconstructive aspects is either to have a ileal conduit, which is a bag on the skin, or to have a neobladder, which is to reconstruct a new bladder out of bowel, which is all on the inside and is close to normal anatomy, as close to your normal anatomy as possible. A neobladder is a formation of a new bladder out of bowel. So we borrow a segment of bowel, often 40 to 50 centimetres of bowel, and we do origami to it to turn it into a ball with a chimney on the top, and then we plug that in and we join that to your existing sphincter and we plumb it into your kidneys. So the bladder fills naturally, or the new bladder fills naturally, draining from your kidneys, fills up slowly, and then you void and you empty that bladder through the normal mechanisms which we're all used to. But it's worth saying that that's not the same as having your old bladder. You don't necessarily get a sensation that you need to void, and you need to void on the clock, not when you need to, and that depending on how much you drink, obviously. And that is important overnight as well as during the day. Immediately after your operation, you have a catheter in, and that's really to allow all the joins and the stitching that we've done on the bowel to heal up and become watertight. But while that catheter's in, it's very important to allow that to drain and not get blocked. So the new bladder, your neobladder, is made of bowel, and it still produces a little bit of mucus, and that mucus can block the catheter, and if it becomes blocked, then the bladder can fill up and that can pressurize the stitching, and we certainly don't want any of the stitching to break. So we teach you how to do regular washouts of your bladder, and we'll teach you that on the ward. The nurses do it to start with, but then by the time you go home, you'll be comfortable doing that yourself, and then we bring you back to the ward often at about 3 weeks or so, and get you back on the ward and take the catheter out, and then you start using your new bladder and start to stretch it up. When you first start using your new bladder, the bladder is very small, and therefore you have to empty it quite regularly. So we start often at 2-hour intervals, and you have to set your watch and go every 2 hours. But as the neobladder stretches up, as it will do in time, then the time intervals between you having to void will be longer and longer. And that will depend in part on how big your neobladder gets and how much you drink. Some people's neobladders don't empty completely. It's important that your neobladder empties completely, because if it doesn't, that can predispose you to getting infections. So sometimes if the neobladder doesn't empty completely, we have to teach you how to pass a very soft catheter, small catheter, to empty the bladder or to help it empty. And that's a little bit more likely in ladies than it is in gentlemen, just through the mechanics and the nature of how the neobladder works and how it functions. Immediately after the catheter is removed, it will only be a few weeks after the operation. The pelvic floor muscles will still be in a recovery phase, and they're not going to be as strong as they will be if we look at 3 months or 6 months or a year down the line. Now, we teach you how to do lots of pelvic floor exercises to get those as strong as possible, but in the first few weeks to months after the operation, they're not going to be that strong, and you may leak some urine, and we'll teach you how to cope with that with pads or with other devices where they can catch the urine and keep it away from the skin.
It was interesting, and I mean, I think one of the things that I had decided very early on, if I was going to have surgery, I wanted a neobladder made, because my wife and I are keen cyclists, and one of the reasons I mentioned a neobladder was I thought, how the hell am I going to cycle with a stoma? Although it can be done, because I'd had a friend who did exactly that. And from my point of view, if anybody's in that position and you've got the options, don't even think about going down the stoma path, because, I mean, I have little in the way of difficulty at all.
It's been described as being as near normal as you can get, and it is during daylight hours, I suppose, insofar as you do get a sensation of the need to spend a penny. Not quite the same. It's just a general little dull ache, perhaps. Maybe a dribble. Maybe a little kick in the kidney. Along with not watching how much you drink. yes, it's not really a good idea to go out and drink five, 6 pints. But I have had on a very rare occasions had sort of 4 pints and dealt with that.
Within 3 months,
Yes.
he was much, much fitter. We were out and about and living pretty normal lives. Within 5 months, he was playing golf again.
I think that my concept about it was my tissue, so there was no chance of it infecting, reactive. Or it was me, just being replumbed really, and I felt very comfortable about the whole thing. So there was a lot of nerve damage, which meant that the feeling in your lower body was somewhat restricted to begin with, but I was assured, and I had a wonderful liaison nurse who effectively I was able to talk to when these things didn't quite work, and she told me that it would eventually, the feelings would come back. The feeling comes back, and anybody who's had this shouldn't worry, because it does return.
I can only think of my own thought processes. Having read all the information, the idea of having a neobladder, which is for all intents and purposes just an internal bag rather than an external bag. And as I say, being an active person, I felt that would be much more beneficial to me. And that's been my experience. But as I said, the worst case, should the neobladder not work, you can revert to the stoma. So, to my mind, it was a no-brainer, really.